Hi, I'm back again at my usual morning walking location at Jinming Pond to talk about 无名天地之始. So, without a name is the beginning of heaven and earth. This has two classical interpretations in the annotations. Number one, 无名 can mean without a name. Two, wu and ming can be non-being is called. The reason is because the term wu means without, or it also means not to exist, not to have something, right? The absence of something. And ming means name. So grammatically, it's perfectly legitimate to use either interpretation. It's part of a pair, the second one being yo ming wan wu zhi mu, right? So being is called the mother of the myriad things, or it can also be when it's present, or when it exists, when it is called, I should say, it is called the mother of all things. So we're going to deal with the first one today. When you think about the idea of no name or non-being being called, actually they're really the same topic. So this is one of the things that I think for people who want to interpret the Tao Te Ching, they need to come to terms with this particular issue. I get emails relatively frequently, it's maybe not more than 10 or 20 a year, but I get emails relatively frequently which ask me, hey Rob, which Tao Te Ching interpretation is the best in terms of English language ones? And to be completely frank with you, I don't know, because I haven't read them all. But basically, one of the things that people frequently say is, hey, listen, there's all these different interpretations and they come out looking completely different. How do I know which one to pick? And the answer is try to learn it in classical Chinese if you can. I'm here to help to the greatest extent possible. I can't claim perfect proficiency, but I can claim at least some knowledge of the text, so that's why I'm making these videos. But basically, a lot of the time, these different interpretations come out approximately the same, without a name. What is it that is being talked about here? Or, non-existence, what is it that doesn't exist? So what we're talking about here specifically is the activity of the Tao. And so if we say without a name, we're referring to the precondition, right? So in the last couple of videos, we talked about this thing that can't have any name attached to it, right? It can't be spoken, and it can't have any name attached to it. And we explained how Huang Yuanji, he had certain ideas about how this thing is the road that connects all things, and it can actually be used as a tool in our lives. But at the same time, it's not something that can be grasped, seen, or felt in any way, other than being able to interact with it in its original form, which precludes self-presence, right? So the self has to be removed from the equation to be able to use this thing, even though this thing is always present. So having said that, if we go back to my preferred version, which is non-being is called the beginning of heaven and earth, then ultimately what we're looking at here is the idea that before there's any world created, there's an initial state of non-being. Or another way to say it is, before there's anything created, we can't put a name on it. We don't know what it is, right? It's a non-phenomenon. Now, if you, I like to use this as a comparison, but let me plead ignorance first about anything to do with astrophysics. But I like to use as a comparison the concept of the Big Bang, right? So prior to the Big Bang, my basic understanding is that it's hypothesized or theorized that there was a confluence of different gases that came together and produced this Big Bang event, and this produced the universe in the form that we know it now, which starts out as a massive, very, very fast, very hot, energetic event, and gradually cools down and becomes entropic enough to live in, and then becomes so entropic that it can't be lived in, right? And then, you have the eventual right, dissipation and heat death and the loss of energy in the universe, right? So if we think about that as being sort of akin, actually, to what Taoism wants to tell us, the basic idea is that there's an initial state which is generative in nature, and that initial state which is generative in nature comes from a prior state which doesn't have anything associated with it. It's if we take a very, very, very strict interpretation from the Tao Te Ching, we can look at chapter 25, I think, which says that before heaven and earth were generated, there was something already present that was mixed in a kind of primordial state. So the question is that in reference to the Tao, or is that in reference to what the Tao creates? I don't know, and my opinion personally is that this is intentionally left vague. But we do have later interpretations to work with. And so one of the important things to recognize about the Tao Te Ching is that it exists within a broader tradition of Chinese philosophical thought. And one of the really great later interpretations we have is Zhu Xi's commentary. So Zhu Xi is Neo-Confucian. He's arguably the father of Neo-Confucianism, although maybe Zhou Dunyi is the grandfather of Neo-Confucianism. And what Zhu Xi says is that there's a primary state to the universe called Wu Ji. Now, if you ever practiced Taiji, you know that there's this thing called Wu Ji, and you might think of it as a posture, right? The non-extreme posture is how people translate it. But I would prefer to look at Wu Ji as the absence of anything, right? So it's not just non-polarity. That could be what it means, but in my preference is to say Wu means without and Ji means maximum. So it's the maximum of non-being, let's say. And so this state produces a secondary state, which is called Taiji, which is when being comes into form. And this interpretation, although it's technically Confucian, actually really explains Taoist theory very, very succinctly. So if you are a person like me who likes to practice forms of Taoist meditation, then this version of the explanation of the primordial event is the most useful explanation that you can have. So in that regard, if you say the absence of anything comes before the presence of anything, right? This is arguably a reasonably succinct and accurate way to explain that particular interpretation of this third meaning component in the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching. So in that regard, when you look at the character Wu and then Ming, it doesn't matter if it's without a name or non-being is called. That is... they can both be interpreted in the same way. The more important thing is what it facilitates, and what it facilitates is the beginning of heaven and earth. So what are heaven and earth? I think generally speaking that we can think of the sky as a place where phenomena are perceived as happening over a period of time which are set and predictable. Right, so you know that the sun will rise and the sun will set. You know approximately, you can take measurements of where it's going to rise and set relative to every day of the year. You know where the constellations will be, and notwithstanding the occasional blip that's caused by various different cosmic events, or very, very gradual changes over extremely long periods of time, which are longer than current human time, you can basically guess where they're going to be, right? So there's events that happen upstairs, and then the events on Earth are seen as a reflection in some way of the events going on in the heavens. So this is the approximate meaning of those two things, right? There's things that happen on Earth which are highly relevant to us, that we have a hand in, and there's things that happen in the heavens which are sort of like the destined events of our reality that deeply influence what happens on Earth. And you can be as mystical or as practical about it as you want. I'm not here to judge you about how to judge those things. I think effectively that if you get the idea that the sun and the moon have predictable cycles, the constellations have predictable cycles, you know that the rains will come typically during various seasons. As a Canadian, we typically kind of don't pick up that we have a rainy season because it's typically a snowy season. But if you're where I am right now, beautiful Kaifeng, Henan, then you would know that the rainy season very specifically comes toward the end of July and it lasts until mid-August. And one of the things that that does is chases away the heat, right? So you have these pretty predictable sort of events that happen on the Earth. And those things are all the activities of heaven and earth. So that's a really simple way that we can define those two characters. But then at the same time, they come from an initial nothingness, right? Before any of that existed, there wasn't a world, right? And we know this because we know in cosmic time that there was a time before the world existed. And we think probably there might have been a time before the universe, at least this current incarnation of the universe existed. Ergo, we call that non-being. Now, here's the thing. we don't know for sure if it's non-being totally or if it's some other state of being that became what we have now. And I would argue that the Tao Te Ching gives us a hint that we cannot absolutely define the Tao as non-being. Now, some people have tried, right? This doesn't stop people from trying. There's a great commentary of the Qing Jing Jing, which is attributed to Hun Ranzi, where he basically says the Tao is Wuji, and people in the past were chicken to say so because they didn't want to leak out the heavenly secrets, which is something you see coming up over and over again in these documents, right? We don't leak the heavenly secrets, but here's some. But I'm not sure that's really a reasonable interpretation. I would err on the side of caution and say that probably the idea is more like the Tao creates non-being and being. This is what the Zhen Yangzi, Cao Jianyi, what he said in his Tao Te Ching sort of appendix. It's an appendix to the comment to Huang Yuanji's commentary. What he said is, hey, look. He didn't say, hey, look, that's me, interjecting my own idea. But basically what he said is, you have these two things called being and non-being, and the Tao is the mother that generates both of them. And so if you want to, get a sense of the activity of the Tao, it's something which it predates being a non-being. It causes both of them to come out, and they both have their operations in the world. So rather than saying, well, non-being is definitely the Tao, which I think is a terribly mistaken idea, what we should say probably instead is that this is sort of essential to its the way that it functions, right? It's generative of this non-being event, which causes the beginning of heaven and earth. But look, here's something interesting, right? Heaven and earth certainly are being, right? They exist within the infrastructure of being. So non-being definitely doesn't preclude being. It happens to be a cosmic step in the process of being becoming. And so if you look at 无名为天地之始, right, then that is pretty okay interpretation of it, I think.